Wasn't Addie Thompson incredible? Huh? Oh my gosh. Yeah. So Alyssa Brown, who's just disappeared, same program, Youth Institute, Borlaug grew on intern. 70%, while I was president, of the participants were all young women. Yeah, filling them with the spirit of Norman Borlaug, and it's amazing what happens. When I took over as president of the World Food Prize in 1999, the Youth Institute consisted of 20 students, all from Iowa, for a half-day program. But Norman Borlaug told me, and John Ruan Sr. told me what their vision was, their dream was, and so I began planning and impacting and getting it to where it is today. And I think the Youth Institute students or teachers are all here, right? Are you here? Wave and yell hi if you're here. And all right. So some of them, I assure you, are going to be up here speaking like this with the same passion that Addie had. So my job now is to introduce two historic figures for their conversation about dreaming, planning, solving problems. Ambassador Andrew Young is a special place in history. Executive Director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, close to Martin Luther King Jr., the Member of Congress, Mayor of Atlanta, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. And I'll talk about that in 1 second. And Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack, two-term governor of Iowa, and now has been Secretary of Agriculture for 11 years and 200 and some days. And by the end of President Biden's term, he will have moved from 7th place to 5th place on the all-time list of members of the cabinet. And there, so two incredible individuals. On behalf of Ambassador Terry Branstad, Mashal Hussein, the World Food Prize, we are so honored and privileged to have them with us today for this important conversation. Now, Ambassador Young assumed office as Ambassador to the United Nations on January 20th, 1977, as President Carter was sworn in. I had been working as a career State Department Foreign Service officer on Henry Kissinger's National Security Council staff at the White House in the Ford administration. The phone rang. I came over to the State Department, and because, you know, we're the paid mercenaries, we work for who's ever in charge under the Constitution, and I moved into the office of Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, the Assistant Secretary for East Asia, and I was witness for the next 3 years to this incredible period of dreaming, planning, and solving. Dreaming of peace in the Middle East, planning, and then bringing together the Camp David Accords and bring the leaders of the Palestinians and Israel together, incredible handshake, and a moment that we all pray will come again in the Middle East. There was the dream of China and the US could have a normalized relationship, and there was the planning and the solving and the establishment of diplomatic relations. But there were also things to be planned for that didn't have the time and had to be solved immediately. At the end of 1978, the State Department loaned me to the state of Iowa, and I arrived to work with Governor Bob Ray and then Lieutenant Governor Terry Branstad. And the crisis of the boat people refugees was suddenly before us. Thousands of individuals trapped in Vietnam, yearning for freedom, were getting on small boats and going out into the South China Sea, desperately seeking freedom, and were being marauded and turned away and pushed back out to drown in the ocean because no country, including the United States, was taking any more refugees. And Governor Ray wrote to President Carter. We went to Washington, met with him, and to reopen America's doors. Iowa would accept double the number of refugees we had already resettled. And in July of 1979, at the United Nations, Andrew Young is our ambassador there. Walter Mondale, Vice President Mondale, announced America was taking 168,000 refugees a year. The boat people were saved and able to come to America. So somewhere out here is a young woman who I met 2 days ago, and who was one of those boat people refugees as a very, very, very young girl. And she's lived in freedom and raised her family, and like that other now 1 million people who, because of that bipartisan partnership between Governor Ray, President Carter, and that are able to live in freedom. And that. Secretary Vilsack, likewise, when I came back to being ambassador to Cambodia to take over the World Food Prize, I went to see him. It was in his first term at the state capitol. And I said, no one seems to know about Norman Borlaug and the World Food Prize. His dream is to build it into the Nobel Prize for Food and Agriculture. And John Ruan wants this to be the center of agriculture in America. And what can we do? And he suggested, well, let's have a day of recognition for Norman Borlaug, Democrats and Republicans working together. And I said, any chance we could hold our ceremony here in the state capitol? And he said, for Dr. Borlaug, of course. And for those of you who go tonight, this is happening because, and our banners are up on the state capitol, because of that conversation with Secretary Vilsack. And he has been then working with us, building with us, advocating for the World Food Prize, providing support for the World Food Prize, being involved with us, and continuing today to make those additional steps of bringing agriculture and representing rural America. And so please join with me in welcoming two incredible leaders for their conversation, which is going to be moderated by Matt Paul, who's worked with Secretary Vilsack, now a principal at Cornerstone. And when I needed something to get done, I would call Matt and say, Matt, you think we can do this? And he knew just how to get things done and make them work. And that. So please welcome Ambassador Andrew Young, Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack, and Matt Paul.
Please welcome United States Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack and Chairman of the Andrew J. Young Foundation, Ambassador Andrew Young.
Good morning. Ambassador Quinn, thank you very much.
Just wait till.
Pardon, Ambassador Young, all good?
I think I'm all right.
Ambassador Andrew Young. We have an ambassador, a U.S. secretary, a former mayor, Ambassador Quinn, Ambassador Branstad, Governor Branstad. I have no idea what anyone's title is in this room, but it's an honor to be here. Thank you all for joining us on this important day in Iowa. Let's start, gentlemen, with the basics. How did you two meet?
I was, I was invited to go to Africa with President Carter just after he left office, and Norman Borlaug. And they had their own way to develop agriculture. In fact, they were looking for 5 countries where they could find 5 individual farmers. They had this notion that agriculture had to be private sector, it couldn't be government. And they took me with them, not because I knew anything about agriculture, but I knew the presidents of the countries that we were going to. And it was a wonderful visit, but it turned out to be really complicated because we flew there in a plane by a Japanese, 707 by a Japanese philanthropist, Sasakawa. We had a partnership with a Pakistani bank that couldn't get its money out of Africa, so they agreed to provide the seeds and fertilizer for the 5 farmers in each of the countries. And it went off okay, except that it got to be really controversial and nobody talked about it anymore. But I was in private sector then, and I probably spent 3 or 4 hours talking to intelligence agencies about what was going on. And I mean, I went for a ride. But it was food production is controversial. And especially in the places that we selected, which was selected largely because we had farmers that had private sector farms and real interest in organizations, but I don't know what happened to it. It hadn't made me give up on agriculture. In fact, if I can take another minute, I am really interested in, well, I was chairman of the Atlanta Olympic Committee, and we decided that we wanted to stop wars in 37 different places on earth. We went to UNICEF. UNICEF was able to negotiate a war cessation, and we put up the money to immunize people on both sides of the conflict. And I've always felt that why can't we have a peace zone? Why can't there be a part of the Ukraine that, regardless of what's going on, we partner them with the Dutch, who are very good agricultural exporters and technologists, and they got plenty of money. They put $2 billion in Atlanta when I was mayor. Of course, they made it back triple, but the Dutch know how to do that. And but then I look at India, and I see the things that are happening in India, and whereas we tend to think of India as poor, India is booming. And India probably could help Russia develop a food area going straight north that could, especially with their Aadhaar card, and they're helping people with iris scans. I mean, they got 400 people on clear, like we do at the airport. And so it's I was thinking of what can we do with the private sector, with individuals, and well, we did that with the Marshall Plan, because I was just going to high school when General Marshall made a speech at Harvard, and that speech really reshaped the world. I would like to see somebody do that with agriculture. Say, okay, if you want to fight about something, but fight somewhere else. We need this part to grow food. Now, there's a lot of research going on there, and the Dutch, again, are looking for protein, and they're growing protein in the sea with the mussels, and people are eating mussel burgers. Why can't we grow protein in the oceans, especially down the east coast of Africa, down around Angola and Namibia, where people are now taking on the wildlife, eating the wildlife. And it shouldn't be necessary. And we should get the wildlife kind of people hooked into feeding people, but not on wildlife. And I think this is the kind of gathering of people who are brilliant, powerful, dedicated, and when they invited me to come, I said, I'm going to at least spread a few seeds and pray that we end up with a garden somewhere.
Ambassador, thanks. Mr. Secretary?
I should say, too, that that's how we got together, because I was trying to do something in Africa. He was planning to go to Africa, and he's been far more successful than I've been. But we got our success back in Atlanta.
Absolutely. I was governor, and we really hadn't had much of a connection between the state of Iowa and African nations. And the decision was made that in light of our support for biotechnology and for more modern farming practices, there was an opportunity for us to create a relationship between Iowa and African nations. And it just so happened that Ambassador Young at the time was involved in an effort to try to get more information to African leaders about the importance of agriculture and biotechnology. So the trip was planned for us to go to two countries. We went to Nigeria and we went to South Africa. I don't know, folks, whether you realize that we are all in the presence of greatness here today. Ambassador Young has had an extraordinary career, not the least of which was his advocacy and continued advocacy for civil rights. He is one of the most significant civil rights leaders this country has ever had, and so it's an honor to be back with him today. But when I went to Africa with him, I had no idea how popular he was. Oh my heavens! The seas parted whenever Andy Young walked in a room, and that is no exaggeration. African leaders understood his history and understood his significance in America, and were more than happy and proud to be with him. But I do remember we met with farmers in both of those countries, and we began to explain the importance of modern agriculture and the ability to increase productivity, and how difficult it was for those African farmers to consider doing something different than what they had been doing for literally centuries. But that process began, and we had formative meetings, and we have seen Nigeria become a powerhouse in agriculture, and certainly South Africa as well. And now the relationship between the U.S. And those two countries in terms of agriculture is very solid. There's a new government in South Africa that's, I think, very, very much open to a stronger relationship with America. And so it was a wonderful trip, and I followed that trip up with an opportunity to visit a number of African nations with President Clinton in 2008, and I've obviously in my current capacity. And I want to tell the ambassador, we are aggressively investing now, the U.S. is, in Africa. We've had trade missions, a number of trade missions, recently Angola, Tanzania, Kenya. We've had hundreds of participants in those trade agreements traveling from the United States, producer groups, agribusiness, basically creating relationships and developing opportunities for investment both in Africa and for purchasing American products in those countries. We have a Morocco trade mission scheduled next month. We're excited about that. We think over 100 participants and 26 companies will attend that. We also had a reverse trade mission where we brought folks from a number of African countries here to the United States to get a better sense of agriculture. So what started with Ambassador Young in two countries is now spread, and it's an exciting opportunity, and we're investing significant resources in establishing the relationship, and here's why. one half of the increased population in the world over the course of the next several decades, one half of it's going to come from the African continent. And it bodes well for us to understand each other in order to help those countries mature their economies, create middle classes, create farming and production agriculture that's capable of helping produce the food to feed their people. The ambassador is absolutely right about this, and it's very simple. If you look at all the hot spots in the world today, what you're going to find is there are hungry people there. And if you feed the people, there's a much greater chance you're going to have a more stable and peaceful place. And so I think it's just important for us to really focus on that continent. I think there's tremendous opportunity there.
When you think about,
Can I just put something in here that
of course,
when I was at the UN, there were 5 different factions in the Sudan. 4 of them had PhDs from American universities. And we could not find a way to get them together, and that's one of the reasons why the largest collection of people starving in the world today is probably in the Sudan. And so you've got to put the politics, the economics, and the agriculture together, because either one can sort of pull it apart.
Exactly.
if you think about your first visit to Africa and today, as far as fighting hunger and the impact you've seen there, what has changed the most? Can I start with you, Mr. Secretary?
Well, I'm going to.
Well, let me just say,
Sure.
I was in the Congress when I first went to Africa, and Secretary of Treasury George Shultz asked me to go with him to the World Bank meeting in Kenya. I think that was 1974. And from that time on, we had a meeting in the African American Institute, had a meeting in the Congo, and I went to South Africa with Arthur Ashe to a tennis tournament, all of which turned out to be really very political. And but from that time on, we have phenomenal relationships with the African continent, and I don't think we have a school in the United States that doesn't have African students. Now, getting them to go back sometimes is a problem, but the reason that's a problem is finance is hard to transfer back. And but there's a tremendous amount of interest, there's a tremendous amount of talent, and it's almost like Africa, for me, is a jigsaw puzzle. And you just have to take the time and figure it out and put the pieces together.
Well, you know, I think the ambassador mentioned the relationship between the government, the economy, and agriculture. And I think that there's a better understanding that all three have to work collaboratively since we first visited the continent. I would also say that because there's greater synergy between those three and a better understanding of the significance of Africa in the global security perspective, there is a deeper interest in investment. So, for example, we recently established what we refer to as the Regional Agricultural Partnership Program at USDA. It was $1 billion that we put forward to expand significantly our relationship with possible trading partners other than the Chinas, the UK, the EUs, the Mexico, and Canada, diversifying our portfolio, if you will. Africa, critically important to that effort. We're now seeing significant resources, tens of millions of dollars of that resource now being invested in relationships and presence in those African countries. In fact, an outfit that I was affiliated with before, the United States Dairy Export, they're going to establish a sub-Saharan African office. Now that's unheard of. I mean, that's important because it creates presence. If we want to develop the relationship, if you want to enhance opportunities on both sides, you have to have presence. You have to have promotions. You have to have an awareness. And I think the one thing that's really changed is a willingness of the United States to invest in and be involved with Africa, and for African nations in turn to be willing to develop a relationship with the U.S. And so I think you're going to continue to see significantly greater investment from us in a number of countries that are interested. And you mentioned the universities. You know, we have this wonderful program named after Norman Borlaug, the Borlaug Fellowship Program, the Cochrane Fellowship Program, named after Thad Cochran, who was in the Senate for many, many years. And these, just to give you a sense, we've had 125 Cochrane Fellows in the last 5 years connected from USDA to Africa. We've had roughly 35 Borlaug Fellows. These are fellowships that allow researchers to work collaboratively together. So you've got the research component, you've got the investment and the business relationship component, you've got agricultural companies now investing. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity there.
Ambassador?
We had a Food for Peace program that came from this region. And it worked very well, but that was mostly aid. But I wonder if we couldn't get the same kind of government commitment, and it came from this region. Behind peace zones where we work on people worldwide, corporate collaboration, developing a few places in Africa and around the world where they deal with nothing but food production. Because Africa's population is growing. Nigeria will probably catch up with the United States in another 10 years. But I don't see the possibility of them producing food like the United States has produced food because of climate change. And so it's an opportunity for the high-tech world, but the money that they would bring into the African continent is liable to create more problems because you have healthier people, you have smarter people, and if they're hungry, they're going to raise hell some kind of way. Or somebody will raise hell on their behalf.
Let's go to the other side of that. With the greater awareness about the investment opportunity in Africa, the capital moving there, some of the solutions that are working that you've all been a part of, what isn't known? What should we pay attention to that might not be at the top of the radar for folks today?
Well, I don't think there's a full appreciation globally of the capacity and capability of Africa to produce food. It has an abundance of water. All right, let's start there. Many of those nations have an abundance of water, and they have incredibly fertile soil. Soil that has not been disrupted, soil that has not been over-farmed, if you will. So there's tremendous capacity, and that's one of the reasons why we've recently invested additional assistance. We worked through USAID. We were able to identify roughly $950 million going into a variety of countries, 18 of which are in Africa, where we're investing not only in providing commodities so people can get fed, but also expertise, creating an awareness of how that fertile soil and those water resources can best be utilized to produce food. I mean, there's no question that if we're going to meet the food needs of the world, Africa's got to be a heck of a lot more productive than they've been.
You know, that I agree. And I was in a dam in Uganda, and I was consulting for an engineering firm, and nobody had been to that part of Africa, so I took them, and they took me down in this mine at the beginning of the Nile, and these huge generators, 20 feet in diameter, had all been choked by this little leaf plant that doubles its size every 24 hours. And we call it duckweed or lemna protein. And I've been trying to figure with our foundation how to grow that, because when we refined it and grew it, one, it gives off 30% high-grained ethanol, and the protein was 57% protein in the ashes, and 18 different amino acids present in that protein. And it grows wild almost all over the world. But it grows, it's really what guides the ducks south. Because they can, and why we call it duckweed, because the ducks find it in the swamps. But it literally took over the basin of the Nile, and you couldn't poison it, because you'd poison the whole Nile Valley. But if we see Africa as an opportunity rather than a problem, I don't think there are any limits to what we can do. And I used to tell them when I was trying to get them to support the Olympics in Atlanta, I said, look, it's not my fault that your ancestors sold my ancestors and sent me to Georgia. But you have to work with us to bring the Olympics to Atlanta. And we got the Olympics in Atlanta largely because of African support. But now I'm trying to get the money and the technology in Georgia and the United States to go back and let's repay the favors. Now, it's not as gloomy as I make it, but because there are things going on in soccer or football. Africans are playing basketball. I mean, they're showing signs of their abilities. And the first national championship that occurred in Atlanta was in 1969. And it was, we won the North American Soccer Championship. And there was a 19-year-old kid from South Africa who kicked the winning goal. First time I ever saw a bicycle kick over the shoulder. And we offered him in Atlanta $1 million contract to stay in Atlanta. And he went back to South Africa. And I said, this brother is crazy. Until I went to South Africa 10 years later, and he owned the team. And he owned the stadium. And he actually owned the league. And he was a billionaire. And I wish I was young enough to go back over there and play soccer with him and convince him to put some of that money back into food production.
Yeah. You know, the point about protein is an incredibly important one. There are probably plant-based proteins that we don't even know exist that are being grown and raised in Africa that could potentially be. So the extent to which we can create greater presence and greater relationship, the better we will understand that continent and its capacity and capabilities. And the reality is we're going to need proteins of all sizes and all kinds. We aren't going to be able to be choosy about this because of the tremendous demand. As middle classes expand, there's going to be the need for a tremendous amount more protein. And it needs to come from, in my view, it needs to come from sustainably produced livestock, plant-based protein, and yes, cell-cultured, lab-cultured protein. We can use all of that science. We need to use all of that science. And Africa can be a place that can be an incredible contributor to that. And once you get to a point where when you're exporting, right, which is what ultimately you want to do, you want to be able to export so you bring wealth into your country. There's just unlimited capacity there. And the U.S., frankly, has been, I think we've been a little bit behind in terms of our involvement with Africa, but I think we're catching up pretty quickly.
Well, we've really had our own problems.
Yeah, well, we did.
But
we still do.
We also find food and medicine interact in Africa. And that Morehouse Medical School in Atlanta now has a project with Senegal, and their traditional herbs, well, I think aspirin came from Africa originally. But there's constant research going on between Africa, India, and we run into it in our schools in Atlanta. And they're finding they're finding connections and results that are both helpful and profitable here. But it's all just beginning.
You both have such a deep perspective on partnerships that work, collaboration that works. I think agriculture has been a sector that has fostered that kind of collaboration, perhaps more than other sectors. What needs to happen in the future, Ambassador, to continue that collaboration, not only just in fighting hunger, but in spurring development, spurring partnerships and understanding between our countries? I know that's a very simple
I went to
question.
Howard University,
Yeah.
and I went too young. And I remember this great big African brother grabbed me by the back of the neck, and he stopped me, and he said, "Young man, if you would ever slow down and think, you could be civilized." He graduated from Howard University in 3 years with double majors, went back to McGill, and then came back and set up a health service at the medical university, out of the medical university, and was one of Africa's leading neurosurgeons. And I've never been able to feel paternalistic toward Africans. Every African I met was a better athlete, smarter. Only problem is he worked so damn hard that I made it to 92 so far, and he was gone by the time he was 60. But the talent is there. The schools are better than ours quite often. We don't have students coming from other countries in the world flunking out. And it's a good investment to figure out ways to recycle our students who we educate, but they can't go back on their own. And so companies, the agribusiness companies are beginning to take them on and train them, and our systems work when we pay attention to the needs, and they almost always profitable if we can work out the politics and the humanitarian need.
You know, I would say that there needs to be a willingness to take a chance on Africa. When I talk to business leaders or commodity group leaders, they're much more comfortable with a system that they know, much more comfortable with a system that's been stable and secure for an extended period of time. So they know how to do business, for example, in a number of Southeast Asian countries because they've been doing business with them for a while. They know how to potentially tap the Indian opportunity in India. They're less comfortable with the African opportunity, and I think they need to get over that. They need to get over it because, again, a significant number of their future customers are going to be living there. They need to get over it because our ability to feed the world is dependent on Africa being more productive. They need to get over it because the security of the world is definitely connected to having significant relationships with governments in African nations. So American enterprise, American business can be very helpful, and agribusiness in particular, because we can offer the ability of these folks to be more self-sufficient in terms of being able to feed their population, which, as a political leader, that is job number one. You need to make sure your people are fed. Secondly, I think there's a philanthropic opportunity as well. And I think we need to be aware of that opportunity. And I think our universities, as good as they are and as good a job as they've done in the past, can do an even better job of creating opportunities. And our system within the U.S. In terms of inviting people to this country, I think, candidly, we've got some work to do. We've got some work to do to make it a little bit easier for some of those young people to get into this country and have that experience, either to educate us, right? To educate us. So I think there are some challenges with this relationship, but if you understand the size and magnitude of the opportunity, then there ought to be enough folks willing to take the leap. And I know at USDA we are, as I said, heavily invested in a variety of programs. We have our Food for Progress program. We have the McGovern-Dole program, where I think is one of the most successful programs in establishing a link between the U.S. and African nations, where we're helping to feed students. It's the reason for many of them to go to school, to get an education. It's an incredible program, and frankly, we probably ought to be doing more of that.
We had a tremendous conversation here yesterday with ag ministers and diplomatic leaders from Sierra Leone, Honduras, Tanzania. At the center of many of the opportunities and challenges that they described, of course, was climate change. What are some of the solutions and opportunities and challenges you see in this? We have about 8 minutes. I know we could talk about this for a couple of hours, but just top of mind, start with you, Mr. Secretary, and then Ambassador Young.
Well, I'm very proud of the initiative that we started with the United Arab Emirates. Pretty interesting combination. The United States, very large agriculture producer, UAE. They're not self-sufficient when it comes to food production. But we started this Aim for Climate initiative, which was designed to encourage innovation and innovation sprints directed at trying to help small farm holders in developing countries. We started with a handful of partners. We now have over 600 who are partners in this Aim for Climate effort. We started with a couple of countries. We now have 56 countries who are signed on. We started with a couple $1 billion in investment. We're now at $17 billion. We started with a handful of innovation sprints. We're now over 70 innovation sprints. It's a 5-year program, and it's going to transition to Aim for Scale, where many of the innovations that we've identified during this process will be scaled up in a partnership that the UAE has with the Gates Foundation. As part of that, the U.S. established the Climate Hub, International Climate Hub. And this is a virtual location where all of the information that we are learning from our own climate-smart agriculture experiences. We have 135 projects across all 50 states, over 100 commodities, engaged in embracing nearly 200 climate-smart practices. We're measuring or monitoring or verifying the climate results, and we're going to provide the information to the world about what works in terms of the various products and commodities that we grow in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions or sequestering carbon, or doing both. So those initiatives, I think, are a reflection of the U.S.'s commitment not only to be involved with climate-smart regenerative agriculture, but also to share that knowledge and information. And I think the sharing of it is really, really important. And I think in the past, there's been and I think Norman Borlaug, he understood the importance of sharing. Give it to the farmers will take it from there. And I think we need to replicate that with reference to our learnings on Climate Smart. So it's a major initiative. We've got billions of dollars invested in this, and we're going to continue to see the fruits of this over the next 3 to 5 years.
For some reason, sports and music seem to find their way everywhere. And the musicians here immediately become heroes around the world, and vice versa now. The connections are potentially there. The corporations that are relocating in Atlanta from the Silicon Valley, and I insist that they're looking at Atlanta as a base from which to fly to Africa and get set up. And they're putting money into the universities in and around Atlanta. And I can't get anybody to admit it, but the future markets of the 3 billion people on the African continent and the resources that are under the earth there. And well, I'm an optimist in spite of it all. And where there's a will, there's a way. I still remember that the reason Coca-Cola got planted in Africa is the young man who went from Clark Atlanta University found some businessmen in Adams College, a college named for John Adams, second president of the United States, down there in South Africa. And they owned South African breweries. And the reason Coca-Cola never pulled out of Africa during the apartheid was Carl Ware arranged to sell Coca-Cola bottling to South African brewery, and South African brewery arranged for the money to go through Bishop Desmond Tutu in his education for children. And it's one of the cases where the private sector really worked well. Those kinds of projects that we begin to expand more. And I think they're going to happen. There's not a school in Iowa, and certainly not a school in Atlanta, where you don't have, well, I think there were 170 different nationalities represented at Georgia State University in 52,000 students. All of them won't go back, but some of them will. And that's what keeps me an optimist. I believe in democracy, I believe in capitalism. And I believe there's enough food and talent and good spirit in the world for us to make it possible to get food and peace together and eat healthily and quit fussing and fighting.
To underscore the point the ambassador just made, we can also take a look at some of our competitors on the world stage. What are they doing? Where are they investing? Where do they think the future is? China, obviously, significant investments in infrastructure in Africa. Why are they doing that? Well, develops relationships, develops a presence, develops a connection, and to a certain extent, a dependence and a reliance. So I think well, we can do infrastructure and we can do all of that. I think we are uniquely poised with reference to agriculture to use that as a principal way of creating the relationship that really is very personal and matters. And I think our companies are capable of doing that. I think our farmers, our commodity groups are very interested in doing it. I think the U.S. government, the USDA, is investing in those relationships now. So I think the table's set for a significant engagement in Africa, similar to what we did in Asia and similar to what we did in China not long years ago, to get to the point where now China is our number 3 trading partner from an agriculture perspective, and was until recently our number 1 trading partner. So I think there's tremendous opportunity, and as you pointed out, Ambassador, the population growth there is just going to be explosive, and the need is going to be tremendous, and the capacity to meet that need and for us to be helpful and partners in meeting that need is unlimited. And I'm excited about the future.
Well, gentlemen, thank you both. Ambassador, it's an honor to have you here. I will tell our audience, the ambassador was making the case backstage for a number of projects and investments in Atlanta, which will not surprise any of you. You're a legend, sir, and it's an honor for us to have you here, and we're appreciative of your time.
Yep.
Mr. Secretary, welcome home. We're glad you're here. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day. Have a good morning.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.